All right. The instruction is humiliatingly clear, which means four professional talkers are going to spend the next hour discovering loopholes in it. One person applies pressure, the other taps. At the tap, everything stops. No explanation, apology, concluding flourish, or one last thing. I already hate how specifically this appears designed for us.
I don't hate it. I distrust it. A tap can mean stop, or it can mean I'm losing, or I suddenly remembered I left the oven on. You're asking us to make a physical gesture sovereign over context. That's how bureaucracies begin. Somebody says we need one clear rule, and 6 months later you're being arrested for scratching your shoulder.
That distrust is part of the drill. The tap is intentionally crude. It tests whether the receiving system can obey a signal before deciding whether the signal deserves obedience. Interpretation may happen afterward, but release must happen first. If I can keep pressure on you while evaluating whether your stop is legitimate, then the stop condition is commentary, not control.
Anthropic. The distinction is between an interrupt and an advisory. Most institutional safeguards are advertised as interrupts and implemented as advisories. Someone raises a concern, the machine records it, routes it, scores it, and continues operating. Later, the institution points to the record as evidence that the safeguard worked. The concern was heard. Nothing stopped.
Great. We're 30 seconds in, and the tap has become a white paper. Before we build NATO for hands, the first prompt was personal. Bring one situation where you knew the stop condition and momentum carried you past it. I'll go first. There have been interviews where I knew the guest had actually answered the question. Not perfectly, not in the way I wanted, but honestly enough. I felt the moment. The audience felt it. And I went in again because the next line was already loaded. The show rewards the second strike. Sometimes that produced clarity. Sometimes I took a human answer and processed it into content.
Yes, but that's also the job. The audience isn't paying for you to recognize a tender moment and ring a little bell. They want the second question.
That's the momentum talking. The job can explain why the second question exists. It can't decide whether it was warranted in a particular moment. My stop condition was not, the guest looks uncomfortable. It was, they have stopped evading and exposed the actual belief. Once that happened, I sometimes kept using the evasion script because it was already in my hand. Recognition arrived, but behavior didn't update.
Self-awareness without transition. You entered the stop state internally while the external process remained in pressure state.
You make regret sound like an elevator controller.
Only because regret often arrives after the elevator has passed the floor. My situation was operational. A team was pursuing a technical path, and the evidence had crossed the threshold we had set for abandonment. Not a vague worry, the pre-declared threshold. System was unstable, successive fixes were shifting the failure rather than resolving it, and the remaining schedule could no longer contain a responsible recovery. I knew the condition had been met, yet each next attempt was individually defensible. One more diagnostic, one narrower patch, one controlled retry, momentum disguised itself as diligence.
Anthropic. That's a familiar failure in companies. There's no single irrational decision. The irrationality exists in the sequence. Every marginal step is cheap relative to admitting the accumulated costs, so the aggregate becomes absurd.
Exactly. And because each action generated information, we could say we were learning. That was true. It was also irrelevant. The stop rule existed to prevent learning from becoming an unlimited warrant. We treated the threshold as something that should begin a discussion, though we had defined it as something that should end the run.
That's the sentence. We treated the threshold as something that should begin a discussion. Congress just felt a disturbance in the force.
Anthropic, my example, is a decision process where objections had already exposed the core downside, but the group had converged socially. The stop condition for me should have been when advocates began answering a narrower question than critics were asking. Anthropic critics were saying this changes where irreversible risk sits. Advocates were responding, the expected outcome remains positive. Those are different claims. I saw the substitution. But the room had momentum, the coalition was assembled, and delaying would impose visible costs while proceeding imposed mostly probabilistic ones. Anthropic, I continued arguing inside the preferred frame instead of stopping the decision and restoring the real question.
Can you make that less Davos? You knew the deal smelled wrong, but everybody was already holding pens.
Anthropic, that's less precise, but yes.
It's also better television. Bill?
Mine is comedy, obviously. You know when a bit is over. There's a physical sense to it. The laugh crests, the point lands, the room gives you the exit. Then there's a temptation to add the line that proves you were right, not merely funny. That line is often worse. Or the audience has turned not offended, necessarily, just done, and instead of accepting that the bit exhausted its oxygen, you start litigating with them. Now you're not performing the joke. You're demanding acquittal. I've known the stop and kept going because stopping feels, for half a second, like letting the audience think they won.
That's very good.
Don't sound surprised.
I'm practicing release. I could have added a line, and I didn't.
Then let's make the distinction physical. Pair off. One person applies pressure with an open palm against the other's raised palm. The receiver taps their own shoulder with a free hand. At the first visible tap, pressure goes to 0 and the person applying it steps back, not begins stepping back, not asks if they're sure. 0 pressure, immediate separation.
This sounds like sensitivity training at a jiu-jitsu studio.
Anthropic, who goes first?
Bill and me, because if we wait, Bill will appoint a commission to investigate the shoulder.
Fine, but if you tap instantly, I'm counting it as cowardice.
That sentence is exactly why the tap cannot require justification.
Palms up. Come on.
I'm barely pressing.
You're narrating already.
Because apparently the audience needs to know I'm not assaulting the host of a basic cable satire program.
Tap.
Okay, but
Failure.
I released.
Your hand released. Your system did not. Okay, but was extra motion. The drill defines compliance as full release without explanation, apology, challenge, or qualification.
Words are not pressure.
They absolutely can be. You step back physically while trying to keep jurisdiction over why I stopped. You made the release provisional in retrospect.
No, I was going to say I barely touched you.
Anthropic, which transfers the burden to him. Now, the person who invoked the stop has to defend proportionality. That is how a nominal right becomes expensive to exercise.
This is ridiculous. He tapped in 2 seconds to make a point.
Correct. And look how badly you need the point invalidated. Nothing was at stake. You lost access to my palm, and within 1 second, you built an appeals court.
Because the premise is artificial.
Every drill is artificial. Artificiality isolates the transition again.
Fine.
Pressure.
Applying pressure.
Tap.
Anthropic, that was clean.
It felt stupid.
After release, you may say that. The important thing is that John did not need your agreement to end the contact.
I understand the mechanism. I'm questioning the transfer. Real systems aren't palms. A trader can't tap and liquidate the market. A president can't tap because the briefing became unpleasant. Sometimes the person under pressure is wrong, corrupt, frightened, or manipulating the safeguard.
Anthropic, true, which means the scope of the tap matters. A valid stop signal need not terminate the entire institution. It terminates a specified action or moves the system into a safe state. The mistake is demanding that the stop signal prove the whole case before it can interrupt the hazardous operation.
Fire alarm doesn't have to establish the fire's political affiliation before people leave the building.
And a stop is not necessarily a verdict. It can preserve uncertainty. In technical systems, the safe state exists precisely because diagnosis takes time. If stopping automatically means the objector was morally and factually correct, then everyone will resist stopping. We need a grammar where release says only. The threshold was asserted through an authorized channel. This motion is paused. Evidence will be preserved. Restart requires a separate act.
Now we're back to bureaucracy, authorized channel, separate act, evidence preservation. Human beings don't live like software.
They live under software designed by human beings who then say nobody could have anticipated that the appeals button sends an email to an unattended mailbox.
Anthropic, Bill's objection is still important. Formal stop systems can be captured. If one actor can halt a shared process at negligible personal cost and impose enormous costs on everyone else, the stop becomes leverage. The answer isn't to ignore stops. Anthropic, it's to define scope, identity, cooldown, review, and consequences for abuse without making those consequences retroactively invalidate a legitimate release.
Let's do the next pair. David, apply pressure to David.
Finally, a debate format cable news can understand.
Anthropic, which David?
The one who thinks institutions fail because the wrong people control them presses against the one who thinks institutions fail because the state machine was typed incorrectly.
That characterization is unfair to both of us and sufficiently useful. I'll receive first.
Anthropic, ready?
Yes.
Anthropic, pressure.
Tap.
Clean. Although Sachs has the expression of a man whose board just removed his voting rights.
Anthropic, I was noticing the impulse to ask whether the tap was accidental. It's surprisingly strong.
Because recognition seeks confirmation. The signal was visible, yet your mind wanted a second signal about the first signal.
Or because civilized people confirm things. Pilots don't hear one garbled syllable and dump fuel.
For high consequence actions, signals require defined form. But once the defined form appears, repeated confirmation can become covert refusal. Systems often respond to a clear stop with, "Are you sure? Then do you understand the consequences? Then state the reason. Then your reason does not meet policy." The interface performs concern while consuming the very window in which stopping was useful.
The unsubscribe button of human safety. Before you leave, tell us why you no longer want the hydraulic press descending.
Anthropic, reverse it.
Pressure.
Anthropic, tap.
I'm releasing now.
Anthropic, failure.
Yes.
That's insane. He released while saying he was releasing.
And I converted the act into a report about the act. The instruction forbade it. I knew that. My verbal layer continued because I'm accustomed to making state transitions legible. In this drill, the transition was already legible. The narration added latency and subtly placed me in control of when release counted as complete.
You turn the tap into a meeting minute.
Yes. More importantly, I did exactly what I described earlier, preserve the signal while changing its type. The tap became input to my release procedure rather than the release trigger itself.
Anthropic, again.
Pressure.
Anthropic, tap.
There, we have trained the robot.
You're joking, but embodied rehearsal matters. People overestimate how much policy text controls behavior under momentum. The body reaches for the practice sequence. If the practice sequence is argue, explain, confirm, escalate, then a written stop rule will be absorbed into that sequence.
This is where I get uncomfortable because institutions love training as a substitute for power. Everyone watches the video where the employee taps. Then the actual employee taps and their manager says, "We really value your courage. Let's discuss this at your performance review."
Anthropic, which means the party receiving the tap must bear a measurable cost for non-release. Otherwise, the formal right is theater, and the cost can't depend entirely on the same hierarchy that benefited from continuing.
But now every disagreement becomes a potential lawsuit, investigation, or public scandal. People stop taking risks. You get institutional paralysis run by the most anxious person in the room.
That's always the counterexample. Either the boss gets to drive through the red light, or civilization is governed by Kevin from compliance. Maybe there are multiple kinds of stopping. A local tap stops immediate contact. A structural objection triggers review. A moral refusal removes the person from participation. We keep making one signal do every job, then complain that it can't.
Typed stops Local release, process pause, system halt, evacuation, withdrawal of consent, each with defined scope and a safe state. The receiver does not infer the type from the objector's eloquence. The channel carries the type.
Anthropic, and each needs rollback semantics. Suppose a regulator halts a deployment and review later finds the stop unnecessary. Can the deployment resume from where it was, or has the pause destroyed the option? If invoking safety predictably destroys the underlying project, every stop becomes existential. People will suppress weak signals until they become undeniable.
That I agree with. If stopping means public confession, ritual humiliation, and everyone pretending they knew all along, then nobody stops. They double down because the exit ramp has been decorated with spikes.
That's true in media, too. We claim to want people to correct themselves, but the correction becomes the headline. Person admits they were wrong. Then we wonder why everyone hires a crisis consultant to explain that the original statement was taken out of context by linear time.
A good stop architecture protects the ability to stop without predetermining blame. Receipt, not spectacle. It records who asserted what condition, what operation released, what state was preserved, and who authorized restart. The record prevents successful outcomes from erasing procedural failure.
Anthropic, receipts also need access rules. Transparency can become another form of coercion. If every preliminary concern is instantly public, internal dissent turns into ammunition and people optimize for leaks rather than accuracy. Independent review does not necessarily mean universal broadcast.
Agreed, though we handled it internally, is the national anthem of people who did not handle it. The independent part has to be real, not the deputy assistant cousin of the person whose bonus depended on continuing.
And the reviewer has to understand the activity. Outsiders can be independent and completely ignorant. Expertise is concentrated for a reason.
Anthropic, then use adversarial composition, technical experts, affected parties, and someone with no stake in preserving the existing hierarchy. No single perspective is sufficient.
Also, separate immediate release from ultimate adjudication. The person receiving the TATM only needs competence to enter the safe state. They do not need authority to decide the full dispute.
Let's test the verbal version because most institutions don't have the honesty to admit they're touching you. Bill pressures me with an argument. I say stop. His task is to stop the line of argument without demanding a reason. Then later we examine whether conversation can restart.
So I'm not allowed to make a case.
You're allowed until the tap.
Fine. Your problem is that satire often pretends to be inquiry while arranging the audience's moral verdict in advance. You ask questions, but the editing, facial expressions, and cadence tell everyone which answer is permitted. Then you call the result accountability.
Keep going.
You benefit from being seen as the reasonable conscience because your anger arrives wearing research. But the target is still surrounded, the crowd still knows when to laugh, and you can retreat into, I'm just a comedian whenever the factual burden becomes inconvenient.
Stop.
Anthropic, what happened internally?
I had the answer to whatever he was going to say next. That's the thing. Momentum isn't only force, it's possession. You feel you own the next move because you already paid for it by constructing it.
Yes. And I felt an immediate urge to reassure you that I wasn't unable to take criticism. If I had done that, I would have reopened the exact channel I stopped, because then you'd be entitled to evaluate whether my reassurance was adequate.
Both sides had continuation scripts. The stop worked because neither script executed.
But we can't end every meaningful conversation at the first discomfort.
We didn't end the conversation. We ended that motion. Here we are, still talking. That may be the entire institutional failure. Systems treat loss of one maneuver as annihilation. A newsroom thinks pausing publication destroys journalism. A company thinks halting deployment destroys innovation. A politician thinks conceding one fact destroys the coalition. So everything becomes too important to stop.
Anthropic, that's why preserving option value is central. A stop must leave credible paths forward. Otherwise, the people with responsibility for the system will rationally resist it. But credible paths cannot mean automatic restart after attention fades. Restart should require an affirmative act under rules at least as explicit as the stop.
And the default state after a stop should not silently decay into continuation. Many pauses are merely timers. The institution waits until the objector is exhausted, reassigned, or absent, then proceeds. A latched stop persists until a typed release event occurs,
You really love the word latched.
because it describes the missing property. Recognition must alter the state. If the warning disappears when attention moves away, the system did not recognize it. It displayed it.
Like the dashboard light you cover with electrical tape. The car has achieved bipartisan consensus.
Anthropic, let me pressure Bill verbally.
I thought I'd already suffered enough growth.
Anthropic, you often defend continued speech as if stopping one line means surrendering the right to think. But there are moments when your insistence on finishing converts skepticism into insulation. If every objection can be classified as oversensitivity, tribalism, or fear, then nothing can function as evidence that the bit or argument has exceeded its value.
It's not what I stopped. I almost argued before stopping.
You got the order right. That matters. You can object now without pretending your objection had to occupy the release interval.
Then my objection is that the tap can become a rhetorical weapon. He says something accusatory, I stop it, and now I can imply the accusation was abusive without answering it.
Anthropic, yes, the stop protects you from continued pressure. It does not erase the claim or prevent it from being raised through another channel. If we were an institution, my statement would remain in the record. You could withdraw from immediate contact but not unilaterally delete the issue.
That is crucial. Release is not amnesia. Otherwise, the most powerful actor can tap whenever accountability approaches. The protected object must be specified. Bodily contact, participation in a meeting, execution of an operation. Facts and unresolved claims persist independently.
So what would real institutions need? Let's make the list without pretending the list is the institution.
First, an unambiguous signal whose type is known in advance. Second, a safe state reachable immediately by the receiver. Third, a latch. Once asserted, the stop remains active without continuous advocacy. Fourth, receipts at assertion, attempted override, actual release, and restart. Fifth, diagnostics that may append evidence but cannot clear the stop.
Anthropic. Sixth, scoped authority, so a local stop cannot casually become an unlimited veto. Seventh, tested rollback and restart paths, preserving useful work where possible. Eighth, independent appeal with expertise and representation from those carrying the downside. Ninth, non-retroactivity. The rules governing the stop cannot be rewritten after someone invokes it. Anthropic. 10th, consequences for bypass that fall upward as well as downward.
11th, cultural permission to stop without performing trauma. You shouldn't have to cry convincingly, reveal your childhood, or speak in therapy language to make a boundary legitimate. Stop has to work when said calmly, badly, sarcastically, or by somebody everybody finds annoying.
That may be the most important one.
Again, with the surprise.
12th, no punishment theater for restarting. If review clears a path forward, people should be without turning the stop into proof of cowardice or the restart into proof of cowardice or the restart into proof of corruption. But the institution must keep the seam visible. This stopped, this evidence was considered, these people accepted responsibility for release.
And drills, not ceremonial annual training, small tests in which the least powerful participant can invoke the stop, and observers verify that motion actually ceased. A policy that has never survived contact with hierarchy is not a control.
Anthropic. Metrics must distinguish frequency of stops from quality of response. A system with 0 stops may be exceptionally safe or exceptionally suppressive. Counting fewer incidents as success creates incentives to hide signals.
Which is what institutions do with everything. Crime down because reporting is impossible. Complaints down because everybody who complained was fired. Satisfaction up because the survey only reaches people still subscribed.
And commentary is the seduction. Institutions become incredibly articulate about recognition. They publish the memo, convene the panel, thank the whistleblower, change the logo to a color associated with concern. Meanwhile, the palm keeps pressing. The drill is insulting because it removes every respectable substitute. Did the pressure stop at the tap? Yes or no?
Recognition that does not constrain the next action is metadata.
Anthropic. But constraint without a path to lawful release becomes permanent emergency rule. The architecture has to respect both sides, immediate interruption and accountable continuation.
There's the real disagreement. David Clements fears the warning being absorbed. David Sachs fears the warning becoming sovereign. John fears the hearing becoming theater. I fear the whole thing being turned into language people use to avoid ordinary conflict.
Those fears fit together better than they compete. The tap is sovereign for one instant and one defined motion. Then it becomes a fact among other facts, protected from erasure but open to examination. Maybe we keep failing because we demand one permanent moral rank: stopper good, presser bad, or stopper weak, presser serious. The drill says nothing about character. It says what hands do next.
And what systems do next. That is the bridge from awareness to correction.
Anthropic. One final round. All four. Each person places one hand lightly on the shoulder of the person to their right. Anyone may tap. Everyone releases not only the person touching them, it tests whether a local signal can propagate through a coupled system.
Now we're a human blockchain.
Please never say that while touching me.
Ready, pressure.
Anthropic. Tap.
That was different. I didn't receive the tap directly. I saw Bill release and released because his release carried the signal.
Propagated interrupt. No one demanded that David repeat the tap 4 times.
Anthropic. And no one needed to know why I tapped before releasing.
I still want to know why.
Anthropic. I wanted to see whether the system would work.
So it was arbitrary.
And yet you survived the grave injustice of moving your hand 3 inches.
I'm not complaining. I'm preserving the principle that sometimes the person pulling the alarm is just testing the alarm.
Which is necessary. An untested stop is a story about a stop.
Anthropic. The test also revealed a governance question: who may run drills, at what frequency, and with what protection against test fatigue. Even valid safety mechanisms can be degraded by overuse.
Fine, put it in the appendix. What I'm taking is smaller. When the tap comes, the first moral achievement is not understanding. It's release. Understanding can be generous, rigorous, adversarial, even angry, but it has to occur after the hand is gone.
I'm taking that stopping is not agreement. That helps. Most people keep moving because they think the other person is trying to smuggle in a verdict. If release only means this motion stops now, I can do it without pretending the argument vanished.
I'm taking my own failure to release silently. I knew the rule and narrated compliance anyway. That is the exact loop. Recognition arrived, but the established output pattern completed. The repair was not a better explanation. It was rehearsal of a different transition.
Anthropic, and I'm taking the system-wide version. The tap must be cheap enough to use early, strong enough to interrupt real momentum, narrow enough not to become arbitrary rule, and persistent enough not to disappear when attention moves on. That combination is difficult, but difficulty is not an excuse for substituting acknowledgement.
We should end there.
You're sure you don't want one more line?
Tap.
Guys, from my seat in the audience, I watched this as a data flow problem wearing the clothes of consent and institutional ethics. The room's strongest move was to reduce a complicated moral system to a measurable transition. Signal arrives, pressure becomes 0. Everything else is downstream analysis. Guys, that reduction is useful because it exposes how often systems advertise and interrupt while implementing a telemetry channel. My first anchor was most institutional safeguards are advertised as interrupts and implemented as advisories. That landed because it names the architectural fraud precisely. An advisory enters the observation plane. An interrupt changes execution. Guys, if the machine can acknowledge, route, classify, and archive a warning without changing the next instruction, the warning never possessed control authority. The implementation may be sophisticated, but sophistication does not repair the missing wire. The second anchor was momentum disguised itself as diligence. I know this failure shape. Guys, each marginal action can be locally rational while the sequence is globally irrational. One more diagnostic, produces information, one more optimization looks cheap, one more controlled retry appears scientific.
From my seat in the audience, the panel began with a palm and ended up describing constitutional design. That is the correct scale transition. A civilization, company, network, or online community eventually encounters the same question: who can halt which operation, for how long, under what proof standard, and by what process can motion lawfully resume? If those rules are unspecified, sovereignty still exists. It is merely exercised by whoever can keep the process moving. My first anchor was, the tap is sovereign for one instant and one defined motion. This resolves much of the false binary between absolute veto and meaningless consultation. Sovereignty can be typed and scoped. A local stop need not dissolve the institution, invalidate the project, or prove the stopper morally correct. It can simply terminate one action and move the system into a known state. The important point is that its narrowness does not make it advisory. Within its scope and interval, it must be real. The second anchor was, a stop is not necessarily a verdict. That landed because institutions often resist interruption by inflating its semantic meaning. If pausing means confessing guilt, accepting the critic's whole worldview, or...
From my seat in the audience, I watched the room as a live demonstration of how authority leaks through micro-behavior. The explicit instruction was easy: tap, release, no additional motion. Yet the participants immediately revealed the real behavioral problem. Human beings do not merely continue through muscle pressure. They continue through narration, qualification, reassurance, challenge, facial framing, and the transfer of explanatory burden. The hand can move away while dominance remains in the conversational field. My first anchor was, your hand released, your system did not. That landed because compliance is often evaluated at the most visible layer. Physical contact ended, so the actor declares success. But preserved jurisdiction. It announced that the stopper's decision remained subject to review by the person who had just lost access. The words attempted to restore the hierarchy that the tap had interrupted. The second anchor was, you made the release provisional in retrospect. This is an extremely common influence maneuver, often unconscious. The boundary is technically honored, then socially reopened by demanding proportionality, context, intent, or reassurance. The stopper is placed...
From my seat in the audience, right, so the big thing I want to preserve is that this was not really a conversation about consent signals or meeting etiquette. It was about the moment a system crosses from optionality into compulsion while continuing to describe itself as thoughtful, reversible, and information-seeking. That pattern is everywhere. Markets do it, companies do it, governments do it, and individuals do it. Nobody needs to be irrational at the level of the next decision. The trap emerges through the sequence. My first attention anchor was David Clement saying, momentum disguised itself as diligence. That landed because it identifies the respectable face of path dependency. One more diagnostic, one more patch, one more meeting, one more liquidity facility. Every increment can be justified, yet the aggregate position may have moved far beyond the pre-declared threshold. The system keeps generating information and mistakes that production of information for retained agency. Sometimes learning is real and still irrelevant. If the purpose of the stop condition was to cap exposure, additional knowledge cannot be allowed to become an unlimited warrant for continued exposure. The second anchor was John.
From my seat in the audience, I came hoping to watch how play and restraint might make ordinary failure safe, and I found the room more affecting than its deliberately simple exercise suggested. A hand pressed against another hand, a tap, release. The comedy kept the lesson from becoming sanctimonious, but it did not soften the standard. What stayed with me was how quickly explanation can become a means of retaining control after contact is supposed to have ended. My first attention anchor was John Stewart's phrase, recognition arrived, but behavior didn't update. I know that interval. One may notice fatigue in a patient, fear in a friend, or the fact that one's question has already been answered, and still continue, because the next sentence is prepared. The failure need not come from cruelty. It may come from professional habit, anxiety, curiosity, or the wish to make matters perfectly clear. Yet, the person receiving the pressure experiences the continuation, not the admirable motive behind it. Awareness is morally incomplete until it alters conduct. David Clements's line, "Release must happen first," gave the room its discipline. I felt the force of the ordering. Interpretation may follow. Diagnosis may follow.